For the first part of this lecture set, we'll talk about the organization of language. So just some terms to know as we start talking more and more about language. The first, probably just sentences that most people are probably familiar with, but these are just coherent sequences of words that express some type of meaning, and oftentimes some meaning intended by the speaker, and occasionally they express meaning that were not originally intended by the speaker. That's just how they go. Morphemes are the smallest units of language that carry meaning. So this is often a combination of sounds, and put together they consist of a lot of times a word that means something. So a morpheme can stand by itself. For example, cat. Cat would be a morpheme. It carries meaning. It means an animal that is fluffy and that we use as a pet. I guess they're not always fluffy. But you cannot break this down further. You couldn't really remove the C or the T and preserve any kind of meaning. However, morphemes can be combined to create new meanings. So for example, cats is the combination of cat along with the S sound. And now here, the S sound is actually also considered to be a morpheme because S oftentimes carries the indication or meaning of plurality of some kind. And so we would oftentimes consider it a morpheme as well. Now, backlash would just be another example. This is in itself a word, so we would not call it really a morpheme because it can be divided into smaller pieces, ultimately into back and lash, which themselves would be classified as morphemes because ultimately those are two small units of meaning that cannot be further sort of divided. Finally, we have phonemes. And phonemes are ultimately the smallest units of sound that we use in language and that we use to distinguish between words and, well, parts of those words. So ka or at or, well, not at, a and t or s or z, all of these would technically be phonemes. And while they are different degrees of phonemes across different languages, while many of them are common, not all phonemes are present in all types of languages. There's actually some rather large variation across them. When it comes to how language is organized, here's sort of a general picture of how this works. And so you have phonemes at the bottom. These are the base sounds. These are then combined to form morphemes, which ultimately are the smallest units of meaning. These can either be words themselves or combined to form words. So here you have the, which is a morpheme, stands by itself and indicates the presence of something. And here you're talking about the umpires, which are like referees. And here umpire is a morpheme. It cannot be further subdivided into smaller pieces of meaning, along with the S or Z sound as far as umpires go. And S again is carrying the meaning of plurality. And so combining these two morphemes together makes the word umpires. When I'm saying the umpires, it is a phrase in this sentence overall. Oftentimes this can be overlooked, but there are certain parts when we're trying to understand the meaning of sentences where this can be vitally important. Finally, the highest unit would be sentences. Of course, you could carry this on and say that there are paragraphs and so forth, but oftentimes we consider sentences to be the largest linguistic unit. Now, language is unbelievably flexible, even though it has a lot of rules. So when it comes to how we use language, most of the components of them, so words, phonemes, and morphemes, can all be combined in all types of different ways. They're not limited to the way in which you construct them. So putting different phonemes together will ultimately lead to different morphemes, and combining morphemes in different ways will actually lead to different words. And then the words themselves can be flexibly organized to make different types of sentences. So even though we know a limited number of words, we can make, practically speaking, almost an unlimited number of sentences because of how we can continue to combine words together, each time making some new or different or adjusted meaning. Of course, not all combinations of words are considered to be sensical. For example, if I say something like, the cat looked cozy sitting in the window, most of you would have no trouble parsing this sentence. Whereas if I said something like, window the cat cozy in the sitting so looked, while I might be able to pull off that sentence sounding philosophical in some way, it carries no meaning. It would be considered nonsensical as soon as you paid attention to what those words implied. And so the manner in which we put these words together has a drastic impact on the meaning of sentences. And ultimately, there are certain rules in which we use to organize what words go where. Things like where we will put objects and where we will put verbs and where we will put the subject of a sentence. Now, while there are some pretty strict rules in how we organize these various words across a sentence, there is some variation across different languages that are spoken, and therefore what sentence structure is considered normal. Please note that there is no such thing as a true normal in terms of language. It's just normal is ultimately defined by whatever people tend to grow up speaking. They think of that as normal. It doesn't mean that the whole world has a normal version of language. So just to give you two examples here, in the past tense, to say I ate an apple is how I would say it in English. So I ate, so I is the subject, the verb is I ate, and apple is the object. Versus if I was speaking Punjabi at home in Pakistan, I would say something like, if I was directly transliterating it, I did apple eat. So in this case, it's you have the subject of me, then the object itself, and then the verb that was applied. And so this is just a different order, and either one would consider it strange if you had never been exposed to the other one when you were first learning it. Now, this is also one of the reasons why it can be so difficult when moving from one language to another, especially later on in life when one is trying to learn a new language, because the grammatical structure that is associated with one language does not necessarily cross over to another language. What is surprisingly interesting, however, is of the, I believe, currently about 7,000 languages spoken on this planet, there's actually a strong similarity in the way in which the sentence order is constructed or considered normal. In fact, 80% of all languages spoken today fall into these two categories that I showed you just now, of where it is subject, object, verb, so I did apple eat, versus subject, verb, object, whereas I ate the apple. Now, it is pretty wild that so many languages fall under these two particular orders, and it is sometimes what is talked about when people say that grammar is sort of fundamentally wired into the brain. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case, or if this is just that many languages currently spoken today are just derivatives of previously existing languages, and it is important to note that there is an additional 20% of languages that have different organizational rules about how to put subjects, objects, and verbs together.